All right, why don't we get started? Welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. Good afternoon, good morning, I guess good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Gabe Scheinmann. I'm the Executive Director of the Alexander Hamilton Society. It's great to have so many students, alumni, member supporters with us today. We're really honored as an organization, and I'm personally privileged to host, frankly, a great American, a warrior scholar on an important new book. It's really my pleasure to have with us Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. General McMaster is the Fuad and Michelle Ajami Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Prior to that, he was the 26th Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs and a 34-year veteran of the U.S. Army. I could go into so many different things about General McMaster. We've had the great fortune of him speaking to a number of Hamilton Society student audiences in the past over his career. In many ways, the most important thing for me, man after my own heart, is that he's actually a historian, in addition to being a warrior, in addition to being a public servant. And it's evident that that has shined through not only in his current book, which we're here to discuss, Battlegrounds, but also in his past book, Dereliction of Duty, which is something that I think should be on almost every college syllabus. So it's a real pleasure to have him with us today on an important conversation on the battlegrounds, on the crisis that the United States faces, or crises in the United States faces around the world, and really get into that conversation. So General McMaster, really thank you for being with us this morning or this afternoon.
Hey, Gabe. Hey, thanks to you for the opportunity, and thanks to all the students in particular for joining. And I love the Alexander Hamilton Society. I think the work you do is more important now than ever, and it's just a real privilege to be with you. Thanks, Gabe.
Great. Well, I'm looking forward to our conversation. As I was saying to the General right before, I'll lead us in conversation for kind of 30, 40 minutes, but then actually really leave quite a lot of time for questions from all of you. And so in the meantime, feel free to enter your question in the Q&A box, or in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And then when the time comes, I will figuratively pass you the microphone. And by that, I mean, I will actually unmute you, and you'll actually get an opportunity to ask your questions directly and live, so we can all hear your voice and have a modicum of human interaction in these difficult times. So anyways, in the meantime, let me dive right in. So this is not a tell-all book about your time in the White House. It doesn't really reveal gossipy or intimate secrets. It's not even really a memoir. It's really more of a blueprint or a clarion call for how Americans should think about the role in the world. So maybe just start off, why did you want to write this book as opposed to probably the book that many, including maybe your agent, actually wanted you to write?
Thanks, Gabe. Well, I just thought, first of all, I mean, does the world really need another palace intrigue book on the Trump administration, right? And I wanted to write something that's useful to Americans, that helps us understand better the crucial challenges we face, and then what we might do to overcome those challenges, to take advantage of opportunities and build a better world for generations to come. And also, Gabe, National Security Advisor job is unique in that you're the only person in the foreign policy establishment who has the president as his or her only client. You're in a position of trust, and to violate that trust and confidence during that administration, I think is a travesty, because really, how are our future presidents going to trust their national security advisors? And especially for me, I mean, I was serving in uniform. I was still on active duty as a general officer. And I think it would have been not just inappropriate, but dangerous to civil control over the military and the military's role in our society and in government. But mainly, I mean, I don't think it would be useful to anybody. I wanted to write a book that Americans and other citizens across the free world could read and discuss and think about the challenges we face, as well as what we have to do together to overcome them.
Great. So let's kind of dive right into the thesis of the book. So you use the word strategic a lot. You talk about how we are victims of our own strategic narcissism, that we need to have more strategic empathy, and part of your mission, and certainly how you saw your agenda as National Security Advisor, was to restore our strategic competence and confidence. Can you walk us through those terms, how they relate to each other, and how, especially for students, again, we kind of think about that in the sweep of how we conduct our foreign policy?
Great, thanks, Gabe. Well, I think strategic competence is at its foundation the ability to integrate all efforts across the elements of national power, across departments and agencies, but also efforts of like-minded partners to accomplish clearly defined goals and objectives that are relevant to our security, our prosperity, and our influence in the world. Our strategic competence and ability to compete effectively in a complex geopolitical landscape that's growing in complexity and growing in dangers, as I try to explain in the book. We are at a disadvantage because of the dissipation of our strategic competence, especially in the post-Cold War period. And I attribute that mainly to a period in the 1990s of overconfidence that was based in our victory in the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as well as the overwhelming tactical victory over Saddam Hussein's army, the fourth largest army in the world during Operation Desert Storm. It was a decade of sustained economic growth in the 1990s. And I think many American policymakers really accepted three fundamentally flawed assumptions about that post-Cold War world. Right? First, that an arc of history had guaranteed the primacy of our free and open societies over closed authoritarian systems. Second, and related to that, is that a great power rivalry was a relic of the past. And third, America's technological military prowess would result in dominance over any potential enemy. If any foe had the temerity to challenge the United States, wars would be fast, cheap, efficient, and lopsided, in our favor. And that complacency, I think, was a setup. It was a setup for strategic shocks and frustrations in the 2000s. The mass murder attacks of 9/11, during which terrorists bypassed our tremendous military strength and technological military prowess with box cutters and airplanes to conduct the most devastating terrorist attack in history. And then following that, the unanticipated length and difficulties of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We often debate, Gabe, should we have invaded Iraq in 2003? I think we ought to debate who the heck thought it would be easy and why did they think it would be easy? And it being regime change and then achieving a favorable outcome in a post-Saddam Iraq. And then of course we had the disappointment associated and the shock associated with the financial crisis, 2008 to 2009. And I think it's during this period of time, as the Obama administration came into power in the United States, that the emotional impetus behind our foreign policy shifted from over-optimism and complacency, maybe even hubris, to pessimism and resignation, almost defeatism. And I think that whereas you could say that our lack of strategic competence in the 90s had a lot to do with not considering the long-term costs and consequences associated and risk associated with action, that in the 2000s we failed to consider the long-term costs and consequences and risks associated with inaction. So if 2003 invasion of Iraq is an example of not considering the costs of action, I think that you have the unenforced red line in Syria, the complete withdrawal from Iraq, in December 2011, that set conditions for the rise of ISIS in 2014. Those are examples of underappreciating, undervaluing the risk and costs associated with inaction. So the book is an argument for regaining our strategic competence by understanding these complex challenges we're facing on our own terms, answering the so what question, right? Why do we care about it? What is at stake for Americans? And then crafting overarching goals, more specific objectives, but very importantly, making some assumptions, especially about the degree to which we have agency, influence, and authorship over the future, we and like-minded partners. Those are steps I think we often skip in the development of policy and strategy, and we're given as a result to what I call in the book strategic narcissism. And this is the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and assume that either our actions or our inaction will be decisive to achieving a favorable outcome. And strategic narcissism is dangerous because it's self-referential, and it doesn't recognize the role that enemies, adversaries, and rivals play. And so I argue in the book as essential and foundational to restoring our strategic competence to inject strategic empathy into all of our analysis and decision-making efforts in foreign policy. And strategic empathy is a term I borrowed from a great historian, Zachary Shore, who defines it as really paying particular attention to the emotions and ideology and aspirations that drive and constrain the other, particularly rivals, enemies, and adversaries. So that's a theme that runs through the book, and I hope that it contributes to a restoration of our strategic competence, but also helps us regain confidence in our ability to implement a long-term and sustainable approach to foreign policy.
And so the book is organized around a series of what you call battlegrounds, which are functionally either country or region based: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. And I'll get into a couple of those in a second. But something you said just now in terms of, looking back in the last 25 years, the post-Cold War era or so, in terms of our combination of naivete and overconfidence, was also this idea of that we had reached, or we were getting to the end of history, and that the battle or these battlegrounds were actually less about, between nation states, but more between whatever you want to call it, the civilized and the uncivilized, the enlightened and the unenlightened. And one of the themes I feel like throughout all of your battlegrounds in this book is that theme that's still there, that we need to differentiate between the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese people. We need to differentiate between the North Korean dictator and the North Korean people and the Iranian regime and so forth. So how do you balance these two views of, do you still see the world as this fight between the liberal, democratic, enlightened peoples and orders and the ability of anybody to get there versus those that not, or in the sort of view that is a little associated with your time in office, this idea of the great game is back, that really it's less about the makeup of the regimes and more about the nature of their power?
Right. That's a great way to frame it, Gabe. I think it's both, right? It's both a competition between our free and open societies and closed authoritarian systems. I personally believe, and this is a theme through the book, that there are no peoples in the world who are culturally or genetically predisposed to not wanting a say in how they're governed, right? And so I am a believer in unalienable rights in our Declaration of Independence, our Bill of Rights in our Constitution. And I'm a believer in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that occurred on the founding of the United Nations. But the mistake we made in the 90s is as you mentioned, that this was the end of history, that the democratic form of governance had triumphed and it was over. Ideological competition was over. Well, it's not over. It never actually went away. But it's making a comeback these days in the form of those regimes that you mentioned and others as well. And so our role is to, I think, in the free world, is to compete effectively. We forgot we had to compete. We actually vacated key arenas of competition in this belief that we had won already. And we had these terms kind of crop into our lexicon of, global governance. Okay, what is that, right? I mean, maybe it's an aspiration, but hey, the Chinese Communist Party and Vladimir Putin and the Kim family regime, the only hereditary communist dictatorship in the world, the Islamic Republic of Iran, this theocratic dictatorship. They're not waiting to be led by the United States, right? They're not part of a condominium of nations that are going to work together in harmony. I mean, they are undermining the values. They're undermining our interests. They're undermining the system that has created conditions for people to have a say in how they're governed and the growth of an extension of democracy in the world. So what I argue for is a return to these arenas of competition and to recognize that that ideological competition is not over. Right? Great power rivalry is not a relic of the past. I mean, I think I use this example of when Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine in 2013. You had Secretary Kerry at the time saying, "Hey, that was so 19th century to do that." Well, actually, that reflects this mentality. Well, he was shocked. I thought nobody would do this anymore. And so I think it's very important for us to recognize the need to compete. You see this mentality of the belief that we had won already, especially in international organizations, Gabe. The idea maybe that there's a prize for membership, in an international organization, when in fact those are also contested spaces, battlegrounds, so to speak. And the Chinese Communist Party, for example, is subverting these international organizations and trying to turn them against their very purpose, whether it's the Human Rights Council, whether it's UNESCO or the World Health Organization, even the International Civil Aviation Organization. And so I think that the book is in many ways, kind of a wake-up call to compete again.
So let's dive right into some of those places where we need to compete, and many have been competing with us, and we need to kind of catch up on. So Russia is kind of the first the first battleground that you talk about, and the first thing that comes to mind. So during the Cold War, in many ways, I'd argue the primary threat we faced from the Soviet Union was not necessarily one of Soviet invasion, although obviously that was important, but of communist or Soviet subversion. Through their cultivation and support of communists and other left-wing parties in the West, they could undermine and revolutionize these societies from within. Today, we talk a lot about, obviously, Russian disinformation, disruption, and to a certain degree, subversion, but it's less clear to what end. Russia's it's not exporting a specific ideology in the same way that in previous times. So in your mind, what is Russia or Vladimir Putin more specifically trying to achieve through these measures? And how do you compare, how do you measure that to what we were actually facing during the Cold War?
Right. So Putin is driven, I argue, by a sense of honor lost and an associated drive, aspiration to restore Russia to national greatness. It is a form of nationalism, jingoistic nationalism, in which he feels that the only way for him to accomplish this goal is to disrupt. And I describe his strategy of disruption, disinformation, and denial, right? The 3 Ds. And because Russia can't compete with us on our own terms, us being the United States in particular, and the European Union countries and NATO and so forth, what Putin has decided to do is to drag everybody else down under the theory that he can be the last man standing in Europe. And the way that he's doing this is to try to sow dissension within our societies, to use divisions that already exist and widen them, to polarize us, pit us against each other, and reduce our confidence in our democratic principles and institutions and processes. He wants to divide societies within European countries. He also wants to break apart the EU, NATO, and rend the transatlantic relationship. And he's doing a pretty good job of this right now. And it's because we're our own worst enemy in large measure, Gabe. I mean, I argue that we really need to do everything we can to bring Americans back together, to restore our confidence in who we are, in our founding principles, and to recognize that our country's always been a work in progress. Our history is imperfect, but it is possible, I think, for us to acknowledge, the radical and noble idea of our revolution, that sovereignty lies with the people, and to recognize the great gift to humanity enshrined in our Declaration and in our Constitution, but also to recognize that the greatest blight on our history was slavery, and a blight that was not removed until almost 100 years later. But we should celebrate, and we should celebrate the emancipation of 4 million Americans after our most destructive war in history. But also, again, in our history, recognize that slavery did not lead to equality and equality of opportunity in our country. And you had the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of Jim Crow and the Ku Klux Klan, the period of separate but equal, but then another triumph in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, during which at least de jure segregation was dismantled, and de jure inequality of opportunity. Although we then also have to acknowledge de facto inequality of opportunity still exists, and we have a lot of work to do in the area to ensure that the degree to which you can participate in the American dream is not limited based on what zip code you're born in, and what school district that you're stuck with because of the opt-out system that we have. There is lots of work, obviously, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd to do. To ensure equal treatment under the law, and so I mean, what I'm concerned about these days is that we have a crisis of confidence in who we are as a people and our common identity. This is in large measure due to this interaction between identity politics and maybe the critical theory and so forth on the one end of the spectrum, and bigotry and racism on the other end of the spectrum. We're tearing ourselves apart. And these centripetal forces are being accelerated by the Russians. who actually, during the 2016 attack on the election, that tell the story in Battlegrounds, and they spent 80% of their effort, the bot and troll traffic, on issues of race. The distant second and third were immigration and gun control, for example. So again, Russia doesn't create divisions in these areas, but they exacerbate them. And we're our own worst enemy in many ways. I mean, I write about in the book how both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party compromised, compromised themselves because it was politically expedient from a partisan perspective, to tolerate or look the other way or participate in Russian disinformation. We have to be better than that. We're tearing ourselves apart here. We're not acknowledging the real nature of the problem and what Russia's actually trying to do. Of course, we have the compounding effect of social media, which is destructive in and of itself, with the avarice of these companies, the algorithms that they use to show to show us more and more extreme content, and which polarizes us further across the political spectrum, and then we have the issues of media. It's we're polarized politically, but then if you lean one way politically, you watch one cable news station. If you lean the other way, you watch one of two other cable news stations. It's terrible in terms of that we're not grounded in the same kind of basic information that we can have confidence in. That can be the beginning of respectful discussions about the issues that we face. And then we have the pseudo media and all these conspiracy organizations. I mean, we're making ourselves vulnerable to this game. And what I read about in the book is how to counter it, pulling the curtain back, understanding it. But really, fundamentally, I think it's education. And I think it's organizations like the Alexander Hamilton Society, bringing people together for meaningful, respectful discussions. I think the society should reach out to those that might ideologically be reluctant to join. Get them in here, get them to be part of the conversation. And we all have a role, whether it's at universities and in our local communities, wherever it is, to even in this time of the pandemic, to bring people back together.
So it's a great point, and I worry a lot about the impact that will have on our resolve internationally. And so, which is kind of my next question, which is, sticking to Russia, much of our defense of Europe and our fellow NATO members rests on the credible deterrent effect of our Article 5 commitment, right? And the same commitment by our allies to each other as well, for that matter. The president has certainly vocalized some ambiguity on that subject. But to your point, because of our strategic narcissism, this is something that we have underfunded for a number of years, underprioritized, and good reason that the Russians might doubt and thus test that commitment. And they see, the overall trend of the last 2 decades of Americans are more interested in withdrawal. So we continually seek to reach out to partner with Putin despite bad behavior. It's a little Charlie Brown in the football a little bit. But so I more seriously, I really ask you, are you concerned that given everything that you see, that Putin will actually test our commitment to collective defense? Are you worried about the scenario where he might engage in that and we might not actually come through with our commitment?
Yeah. Well, I think it would be a huge mistake for him, because I believe we would come through with our commitment. And I think that Europe, it would be a galvanizing moment for Europe as well. President Trump was right, I believe, in demanding more sharing of the burden by our European allies, our NATO allies. Germany in particular, it's been a sticking point with him. Have many animated conversations with him about it, and with my German counterparts, who I have great respect for. The German National Security Advisor, Christoph Heusgen, is a dear friend. I have tremendous respect for Chancellor Merkel. We had very candid conversations about the need for Germany to step up. They have their own domestic political constraints, but I think the leadership of the CDU there, the political party that's in power, as has been for many years under Chancellor Merkel, has to do a better job at explaining the need for Germany to really step up in the area of defense. We were spending about $9 billion a year on the European Deterrence Initiative, the rotation of additional forces to Europe. And that additional expenditure in our defense budget was equivalent to about 33% of Germany's defense spending, which is crazy, right? I mean, so I think that there's reason for that skepticism, but it shouldn't carry over, as you mentioned, to our Article 5 commitment, right? I think it's fine, and it goes back to the 70s, these debates and demands for more burden sharing. But I think that you don't want to create doubt in the mind of Putin. Deterrence is capability times will, right? is your deterrent capability. And if your will is diminished, so is your deterrent capability. Russia, I think, is of concern these days, not because it's powerful except in nuclear weapons, which is obviously a grave cause for concern, especially when you consider this crazy doctrine of theirs of escalation domination, or escalate to de-escalate, in which they would threaten to incinerate a European city and then pose the U.S. with the dilemma of either acceding to their demands or risking a nuclear holocaust. Okay, that doesn't sound like they like they care about security and stability with the most destructive weapons on earth. But it's also because he's increasingly desperate, and he's a desperate and unscrupulous person. He just poisoned his greatest political opponent, Navalny, with a nerve agent, the similar one to that he used in the attempted poisoning and assassination of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in Salisbury, England, in April 2018, an attack that placed thousands of British citizens at risk. And he's also fighting through proxies and mercenaries in Syria and enabling this kind of serial episode and mass homicide there that is generating the refugee crisis that is destabilizing the region and destabilizing Europe. He's reinforcing Haftar's forces in Libya in a way that's perpetuating that conflict, and he's infiltrating brigades of his forces into Belarus right now. So I think Putin is increasingly desperate, because this was supposed to be a big year for him, and it's been a year of disappointment, right? He extended his rule till 2036, but there are increasing protests in the country about his role as apparently the new czar of Russia, especially these protests in the East, I think, are concerning to him. Then COVID hit, and then the collapse of oil prices. His economy is stagnant at best. It's really falling. And so I think when you have a desperate dictator like him, I think it's a dangerous situation. So as you suggest, Gabe, this is not the time to indicate anything less than complete resolve to confront any aggression together and within the framework of the NATO alliance. Russia's also doing its best to try to pull Turkey out of NATO. Turkey, I think, made accepted some of these Russian advances in connection with Syria and the relationship with Iran as well. I think they have a little bit of buyer's remorse at this stage, though, in connection with now Turkish proxies being at war with Russian proxies, not only in Syria and Idlib province, but in Libya, and also now in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I think this could be a time, I hope, that crystallizes even for President Erdogan in Turkey, that his future lies with the West, and it will help him reconsider this relationship or this approach of cozying up to Vladimir Putin.
So let's say, you kind of gave us a whirlwind tour of every bad thing the Russians are doing, and which actually leads me to one of your next backgrounds, which is Afghanistan, which has also been an issue between us and the Russians. And I find actually the Afghanistan chapter in your ways the most important chapter. It's clearly, I think, in the book, the most frustrating battleground for you, maybe the most personal one for very understandable reasons. And also probably the ones that most Americans, if they were to read a book, you're like, how is that of equal weight? Let's say of China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so forth. So in your mind, why is Afghanistan so important to the American national interest? I mean, this is a time where I feel like it's really fallen off the radar, and you're clearly trying to put it back at the front of our discussion.
Gabe, I mean, war is a contest of wills, and we have to have the will ourselves to prevail. And we lack that will now, I think, in large measure because our leaders haven't talked to us about what is at stake in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a modern day frontier between barbarism and civilization. There exists along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan a terrorist ecosystem in which resides at least 20 designated terrorist organizations designated by the United States. But these organizations are not disconnected from one another. In this ecosystem, they share resources, they share expertise, they share training, and they share a desire to wage jihad against their near enemies, which are the regimes in power there, oftentimes in South Asia, but mainly in the Middle East, and then against the far enemies, which is the United States, Europe, and certainly Israel as well. And so I think that it's immensely important for us to recognize that our effort to enable others to fight against these groups such that they do not gain the strength and the ability to commit mass murder against our citizens, to attack our interests abroad, is not a theoretical case. I mean, this is the area from which the mass murder attacks of 9/11 originated. What concerns me is how inept we've been in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, how ineffective we've been with our strategy there. I really believe, Gabe, that if we had deliberately set out to screw it up, in Afghanistan, we could not have done a worse job, and when people are frustrated with, hey, we've been there for 19, 20 years, I think I understand why they're frustrated, because this hasn't been a 19-year-long war. It's been a 1-year war fought 19, 20 times over, right? And it's been the ineffectiveness and inconsistency of our strategies that have, I think, led to the frustration, and in particular, the taking of a short war mentality at the beginning that actually lengthened the war and increased the cost of the war. Just before the Trump administration decided, I think, to replicate all of the flaws in the Obama administration approach to Afghanistan and then exceed them in these talks to the Taliban, I think we had put into place the first strategy that was sound and sustainable. It required a relatively small number of troops to support an Afghan government and security forces, which were taking the brunt of the battle against the Taliban and against the terrorist organizations that are intertwined there in that region, who pose a threat to us, and then also, it was a sustainable level of cost. I mean, the goal was to get down to $15 billion a year, about, which is relatively small number considering other commitments that we have abroad and the historical context of large scale, much larger scale efforts in Afghanistan, for example, of over 100,000 troops and about $125 billion a year, right? So this is sustainable. I think it's useful to think of it as an insurance policy, but it's also useful to think of it as a way of consolidating a victory, right? A victory over the Taliban in 2001, but a victory in the fact that as flawed as the Afghan government can be, as frustrating as it can be, as difficult as the last presidential election was, it is a representative form of government that is striving to achieve rule of law across the country, and has thrown off, this mantle of brutal Sharia that was imposed on them from 96 to 2001 under the Taliban. And so I'm gravely concerned about it, because what we've done in our desire to disengage as an end in of itself is we have engaged in an extreme form of strategic narcissism. We have defined the conflict as we would like it to be, and we have conjured up the enemy we would prefer rather than the actual enemy in Afghanistan. And in particular, we've made this assumption that the Taliban, there's a bold line, between the Taliban and these other groups. There's not a bold line. They're absolutely intertwined and interconnected. There's a great analyst at the Foundation for Defense of Democracy, Tom Jocelyn, who I'd recommend maybe to come to do a seminar with you. He's brilliant on this topic, and the Siraj Haqqani is the military commander, for the Taliban, and is a direct bridge into the Al Qaeda network, for example. And these, I think, are some of the most horrible people on earth, Gabe, just to put it straight. I mean, these are the enemies of all civilized people.
Let me just, on that specific point, actually ask you. You have a quote in the book. It's like on page 194, where you sort of ask, I think mockingly, quote, "I also wondered what those who advocated power sharing with the Taliban envisioned the result would look like. Would the Taliban be permitted to bulldoze only every other girls' school? Would music and art be banned in only parts of the country? Would mass executions occur only every other Saturday?" And so, as a historian, I'm sure you're a little leery of analogies, but is this our Munich agreement? I mean, are we pursuing a policy of appeasement with the Taliban?
Yes, yeah, we are. And the Afghan people, the Afghan security forces, I mean, they're fighting like heck to keep the Taliban from coming back, right? I mean, the Taliban are not, they're not popular in the country. I mean, over 90% of Afghans want nothing to do with them. So somehow we partnered with 5% of the of the Afghan population against the 95% of the population. It's ludicrous what we've done there, and in fact, I think it's worth pointing out that the 8,500 troops we still have there are still fighting courageously despite the strategic, the ambiguity of our strategy, a strategy which I think renders the war unjust because we no longer have defined a just end. So we're no longer meeting St. Thomas Aquinas's, criteria for just war. But so that's concerning to me. But our soldiers are still making sacrifices under these conditions. 10 soldiers were killed this year, but I think it's worth pointing out that about 30 Afghan soldiers and police give their lives every day to protect the freedoms that they've enjoyed since 2001. And I think that's worth getting behind. I think it's also important to point out the heinous acts of the Taliban. I mean, in the midst of the when we were making all these concessions to them, forcing the Afghan government to release 5,000 of the worst criminals on earth, forcing them to agree to negotiations without a ceasefire. The Taliban, in the midst of this, in the midst of our concessions, attacked a maternity hospital and shot dead infants and pregnant mothers, right? I mean, these are the people we're up against. And these are the people against whom we should be able to generate a high degree of resolve to confront. That is a righteous war, Gabe, if ever there was one. And I think it's just a travesty that we and this vast coalition of other countries couldn't generate the will to see it through. We will pay the price and we'll be back. I mean, we'll have to go back at a much higher cost. Very similar to when Vice President Biden calls President Obama from Baghdad in December 2011 and says, thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war, right? Is what he says to President Obama. Well, the wars don't end when one side disengages. And of course, what you see by 2014 is the rise of ISIS, and ISIS in control of territory the size of Great Britain and inflicting a humanitarian catastrophe on people in the region. So I think that's what we're signing up for now with this policy in Afghanistan, and I consider it a travesty. And you probably, I tried to write this book without emotion, but if emotion comes out, it's probably, as you mentioned, it's probably in those chapters.
Well, I hope you're wrong, but I think I know you're right, which is the concerning part about this. And I want to move on to another battleground, but staying kind of on the same theme, which is talking about China. I think unlike Afghanistan, which obviously is less, we do not have popular support in our country these days for that policy. China seems to be one of the few places actually where not only within the Republican Party, the conservative movement, but actually in a bipartisan way, there's actually a lot of support for being tougher on China in a variety of ways. And most I think would agree that China forms the greatest challenge to the American role in the world, but they disagree over why or how it manifests itself, and consequently what the end game should actually be. Earlier this summer, we hosted a debate between two friends, probably of yours and of AHS, Bridge Colby and Aaron Friedberg, over should the endgame of our China policy be one of balance or one of liberalization. And so kind of my question to you is, what are you most concerned about when you look at China? Is it the rise of China's power and its willingness to throw it around and what that entails? Or is it actually the nature of the Chinese regime, of the Chinese Communist Party?
Well, I think you have to connect the two, right? I think whenever you try to divorce, the policies of a regime, and what you hope to achieve through diplomacy from the nature of the regime, that's a problem. I write about that throughout the book, especially in connection with Iran, North Korea, and China, Russia. Well, actually, all of these are examples of how we have pursued diplomatic ends in a way that has been naive and self-defeating, because we're trying to achieve objectives that are inimical to the very nature of these regimes. And so what I try to do in the China chapters is explain, what are the emotions? What is the ideology that drives and constrains Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party? And that emotion, the main emotion, I think, is fear. It's fear of losing control. This is a party that murdered tens of millions of its own people in the context of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, right? And this is a party that remained in power through brutal repression after the Tiananmen Square massacre. They have very much in their minds that that as the country prospers, they could lose control. What if the Chinese people get this crazy idea, that they ought to have a say in how they're governed, right? And so what you see is the party extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power internally in a really sophisticated and brutal way. This involves a campaign of cultural genocide in Xinjiang, where they have put over 1 million people at least in concentration camps. Xi Jinping just last week made a speech and said, "Hey, we're going to put some additions on those concentration camps because it's really good for the Uyghur people to be, to be re-educated, brainwashed in this way." Uyghur birth rates are down 60%. I would just say, Gabe, where's the outrage internationally about that, right? There have been forced abortions, forced contraception with the implanting of IUDs into women, forced sterilization of men. I mean, it's horrible.
It's actually an interesting case study. Should we or can we do something about that? I mean, what does that actually look like?
Well, 7,500 mosques have been destroyed. I could go on, right? So we have the United States has taken, I think, a very strong stance on this. Others need to join us. The U.S. has imposed sanctions on companies that were complicit in the construction of these camps, as well as complicit in establishing this technologically enabled, surveillance police state in China, using artificial intelligence technologies and surveillance technologies, for example, tied to this social credit score, which essentially weaponizes your social network against you, right? So if you take action that the party thinks is inappropriate, or you have thoughts, maybe because they monitor your thoughts as well through your communications and so forth. If you have thoughts they don't like, they will not only penalize you by restricting your access to transportation, to lodging, to loans, to your job, but they'll also place restrictions on your social network. So your social network will say, "Hey, what the hell are you doing, Gabe? Get with the program, support the party." We see this form of oppression now being extended into Hong Kong. And there needs to be a broader outcry about it and broader efforts to impose costs on the party to convince them that they can't get away with this behavior. But I write in the book about how again, this is an alliteration mechanism here, but the Chinese Communist Party uses a campaign of co-option, coercion, and concealment. And what they do is they co-opt us, our companies in particular, by the lure of short-term profits, access to the lucrative Chinese market. They co-opt countries with vast investments under the One Belt One Road strategy in particular. And then once you're in, once you're tied into it and you're seeing the benefits that you're reaping, whether you're a U.S. financial institution, many of which have grown rich through these investments in China and so forth, then they coerce you. They say, "Hey, you need to adhere to our worldview," right? I mean, that's the NBA. This is what happened when Daryl Morey, a general manager of the Houston Rockets, said, "Hey, I'm with the people of Hong Kong." Well, they lost, I think at least tens of millions of dollars of business, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars of business in China as a result. So they coerce you, and they use debt traps, for countries to take over infrastructure. And then once they coerce you, they conceal their most egregious behavior just as, "Hey, this is just normal business practices," right? And so we have to pull the curtain back on it, and we have to impose costs on the party to be able to combat this strategy. And I think we're competing much more effectively than we have in the past. But it's going to take the U.S. and like-minded nations to begin to treat China like we would treat any other authoritarian regime that not only created this kind of a authoritarian system of repression, but then, as they're doing now, actively exports it as well.
So, and I don't know, I want to ask you one more question and then turn it over to audience questions. So if you haven't submitted your question through the Q&A function, do so now. So, and I don't know if you saw just on that NBA in China, Mark Cuban, who's the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, recently gave an interview with Megyn Kelly where she called him on exactly that. And he basically kind of admitted saying, I can't condemn what happens in China because they're a customer and an important one. And so there's a lot of folks that have been co-opted in that way. And that actually leads me to, you have an interesting turn of phrase on page 147 where you say, quote, "Transparent competition can prevent unnecessary escalation between the two countries and enable cooperation on pressing challenges where interests overlap." It was interesting to me because what you seem to be saying is actually the United States finally returning to compete and competing openly, not pretending, not naming China in war exercises and things of that nature, actually could lead to more cooperation rather than confrontation. Whereas I feel a lot in the media, I've been saying the opposite, which is they're very worried about all the tensions that the United States somehow has been created. So if you could kind of work us through a little bit the logic of that statement, that sentence, and to me, it portends actually that you are less concerned about things going hot in the next years as a consequence of how we've reoriented ourselves.
So if I might be a little Chinese here with my answer, I'll call it the three misunderstandings. Okay, there are three misunderstandings, guys, think about the U.S.-China competition. The first of these is that, hey, it's just a U.S.-China problem, and what you hear framed in the media sometimes is, it's just because Donald Trump is so mean that the party's acting out this way. Well, if you look at their actions, right, they foisted COVID-19 on the world by suppressing any news of human-to-human transmission. They then punished the doctors that were trying to raise the alarm. They subverted the World Trade Organization so that they suppressed how severe the crisis was. They shut down domestic travel before international travel. Okay, I could go on about that, right? But then they added insult to injury with this wolf warrior diplomacy and trying to undermine our democracies, our confidence in our own systems, and to bolster China's reputation at our expense. And then they engaged in some of the biggest cyber attacks in history against really all sectors in Australia, for example, but then against our medical research facilities and our pharmaceutical companies in the midst of a pandemic, right? And then what you've seen is the national security law, as I mentioned, the repression of freedom in Hong Kong. More aggressive action in the South China Sea, in which, if they succeed, it will be the largest land grab, so to speak, in history. I mean, they're ramming and sinking, Malaysian and Vietnamese vessels there. Very aggressive actions. Threats to Taiwan, threats to Japan and the Senkakus, attacks and bludgeoning Indian soldiers to death on the Himalayan frontier. Okay, tell me again how this is a U.S.-China problem? No, I mean, this is a free world China problem, right? The second is that, well, there just isn't any international cooperation on this, right? Because, the Trump administration is so again, mean and offensive that nobody wants to work with us. Well, actually, that's not true. I mean, I think we could do without gratuitous insults of our allies. I would prefer that, right? But these have not foreclosed on Europeans and others recognizing the grave danger. You have now the UK banning Huawei, which is the Chinese communications company that is endeavoring to put in all global communications infrastructure for fifth generation communications so they can dominate data flows. I mean, that's scary, right? I mean, would you really expect the Chinese Communist Party to treat your citizens better than they treat their own people? I don't think so. So I think that's important. I think that France is going to take similar measures. Germany's coming around. So there are all sorts of international efforts going on in the context of the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the cooperation on sanctioning APT-10. They're hacking in this arm. I go through a lot of this in the book, so I'll just skip over to the third, which is the point you're making, is that we face this false dilemma of either passivity and accommodation of the Chinese Communist Party, or war, or devastating war. This is how some people interpret, the Thucydides trap, right? That there's almost inevitable conflict between a status quo power and a rising power. I don't buy it, right? I don't buy it. In fact, I think that our previous strategy prior to 2017 of cooperation and engagement had us on a path to conflict because it emboldened the party. That's when the party began to destroy ecosystems in the South China Sea, to build these islands and weaponize these islands. And I mean, what we should have said at the time is, hey, nobody owns the ocean, right? Stop it. But instead we thought, oh, we'll accommodate it. Maybe we'll get them to, cooperate with us on climate change. Really? I mean, all these issues we want to cooperate with them on, human rights, that's laughable, right? And climate change, they're building 70 coal-fired plants a year and poisoning the world with carbon emissions. And so we have to stop letting the party get away, and Xi Jinping, like, who'll give a speech and mention the environment 20 times when he's the worst offender in the world, right? So I think competition is important. I tell the story in the book of when President Trump does the press conference with Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. I think it's an important moment. I'm pretty sure I tell the story in the book, but he points to Xi Jinping and goes, hey, I don't blame you. Like, he's talking about how we're going to compete on unfair trade and economic practice. He goes, I blame us. for being complacent. And I think that's the right message to China. Say you can't blame us for competing, right? We were losing because we left the field, we left the arena. Now we're coming back on the field.
Well, I could go on. We could spend a lot of time, but I really want to get to questions. So, like I said, if put your question in the Q&A box, and in there, I'll call on you. By that, I will figuratively pass you the mic. And so you could just make sure to introduce yourself, and if you're a student, just what school you are. So, Carson Makanga, I am allowing you to talk as Zoom says so. So go ahead, please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Great. Thank you very much for being here. My name is Carson. I'm a junior at Princeton. And my question is, with how broad of a scope should we view national security? So beyond the traditional military-based definition, should we include issues like climate change or world health, or even racism and inequality at home in our definition of national security?
Hey, Carson, thanks for that question. Yes, this is the answer, and I'll expound on it just quickly. In the book, that's how I define it. In the last chapter, I talk about new and emerging arenas of competition, and I have a brief discussion there of the interconnected problems of climate and energy and environment and food security, water security, and health security, and in particular the importance for us to no longer entertain non-solutions to these problems, right? To first work on what we can agree on. On climate, for example, hey, we can all agree that that it's happening, it's bad, and it's man-made. Okay, we can agree on that. We should also be able to agree and recognize that the largest success in reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, was accidental in the United States, and it was associated with fracking and the availability of cheap natural gas, and the transition from coal to natural gas for energy sources. That can be applied as a bridge in the world now. Renewables are becoming more affordable. That's part of the solution, as is next generation nuclear, right? Which is extremely promising with very mature technologies. But we have to pursue solutions by recognizing what impact these solutions have on other sectors as well. So for example, in an effort to solve problems of food security in India, for example, a lot of the water source has been diverted to irrigation, which has reduced dramatically the amount of potable water available for human consumption. I can give you tons of. I give some of these examples in the book, but I think we have to think of national or national security in this connection. I think also we have to recognize that the challenges that develop overseas, are only dealt with at a very high cost once they reach our shores. So whether it's a pandemic and global surveillance to identify outbreaks and contain them early, thanks to China's Communist Party, we couldn't do that on COVID. That's important, and it's analogous to other threats as well. In our interconnected world with cyberspace and space being competitive domains, I read about that as well. We can no longer rely, and we haven't been able to rely for well over 100 years on the great moats of the Atlantic and Pacific for our security. So I think a broader construct is important. And as you mentioned, what I read about in the book is the need to restore our confidence in who we are. I quote the philosopher Richard Rorty, who said that national pride is to nations what self-respect is to individuals, a necessary element for self-improvement. And so I think we really ought to make a concerted effort to restore our national pride, not based on a contrived happy view of history, as I mentioned, but recognition that ours is a very noble experiment in democracy, in rule of law, in freedom of speech, all the rights that we hold dear. We ought to be proud of it. As we go into this election, hey, we have a say in how we're governed. We do have agency over our future. We can demand better from elected officials. And I think we skip over that in today's vitriolic partisan environment.
James Beckwith, the microphone is yours.
Hi, James Beckwith. I'm a junior at St. John's College in Annapolis. So I'm interested more specifically on the question of Chinese ascendancy. I'm curious in your view of the ambiguity of the U.S. relationship in regards to Taiwan, and if we still possess a credible deterrence from a Chinese invasion, and if not, what the consequences would be for our strategically vital relationships on the island, especially with TSMC, who supplies microchips for her F-35s?
Right. Well, this is a big problem, and I call it the most significant flashpoint with China is Taiwan. And in fact, I just wrote an essay. I think it's going to be on the Fox News website in the next few hours that summarizes China's strategies and also highlights Taiwan as the most dangerous flashpoint. I think that our deterrence is still strong. I think what the administration has done recently, with the 4 speeches that were made by the FBI director, the attorney general, the national security advisor, and the secretary of state, I think it sends a strong and very clear message to the Chinese Communist Party. I think also the recent visit of the head of the director of Health and Human Services, as well as Undersecretary Keith Kroc from State to Taiwan, sends a strong message as well. And so does the making public of the 6 assurances given to Taiwan associated with the Taiwan Relations Act. And I don't think we need to go beyond that. I think strategic ambiguity has a certain purpose. I think it's certainly, as you mentioned, primarily to make the Chinese doubt their ability to be able to accomplish their objectives on Taiwan by force. But also, it's useful in making sure the Taiwanese know, hey, you got to be responsible for your own defense. And you've seen a big backlash against the party based on learning vicariously through the fate of Hong Kong. The elections in January were a very strong endorsement of President Tsai Ing-wen, and she has a really good program in place to strengthen the military. They took a blow last year when during the helicopter crash. They lost their chairman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they were rocked back a little bit by that. But the Taiwanese military is getting stronger. They're buying from us, and we're providing them with important deterrent defensive capabilities. And I think what we're doing is appropriate now in terms of also making sure we have forward position forces in the region that are able to respond to aggression very quickly. So I would say what I would say to the Chinese Communist Party is don't make the same mistake that you and especially North Korea made in June of 1950. Because there's a long history of underestimating the United States will. It's the same mistake that Japan made in December of 1941 as well. Thanks, Dave.
Olivia Hadjasek, sorry for butchering your last name if I didn't get it right. Olivia, go ahead. No, okay. We'll go to somebody else. Walker Carter, go ahead.
Yes, and thank you, General McMaster. I guess I'd pose two questions. One, I guess, did you find any kind of potential conflict of interest for future national security advisors in serving in that role as or serving in the national security advisor role as a general officer? Did you have to operate differently, or did you find any constraints or opportunities through having done so?
Yeah, hey, Walker, I think it was a benefit to do it. First of all, the president asked me to stay in uniform. It wasn't unprecedented. General Scowcroft had done it as Deputy National Security Advisor. Colin Powell had done it as National Security Advisor. And I had a number of senators. One of my dear friends and somebody I admire tremendously, John McCain in particular, he said, hey, I hope you stay in uniform. I want you to stay in uniform. Because, it was such a partisan environment. He said it'll be clear, that our foreign policy is not going to be tainted by the same kind of partisan vitriol. And really, having studied national security decision-making, writing about how and why Vietnam became an American war, I saw that during the Vietnam War, President Johnson was basing his decisions on foreign policy mainly based on his domestic political agenda. And I thought it would be important to establish a National Security Council decision-making process, national security decision-making process, that was insulated from those concerns, and the recognition that people who want to voice their opinions based on domestic political considerations will have an opportunity to do so at some point before the president makes a decision. But our process should actually view the challenges on their own terms, and based mainly on what is in the long-term interests of all of us, of all citizens. And I think that worked well. I think it delivered good outcomes while I was there. When I took the job, I was hired on a Monday, and I did not live in Washington, and I started work, on Tuesday afternoon. So, I'll tell you, if I had done it out of uniform, I don't know how I would have done it. I would have had to go through the whole retirement process, medical, all that, and then, find a house. The Army got me a house on Fort McNair. It made the transition super easy for me so I could get to work. And I think the country needed me to get to work. The president needed me to get to work because it was already a difficult transition between administrations. And then my predecessor, who was a friend of mine, I mean, he left suddenly, and so it was important to get to work. So I did that, and staying in uniform helped in that, just in a practical sense as well. But hey, I'll just tell you quickly what a national security advisor has to do, and I think none of these should be affected by whether you're in or out of a uniform. The first thing you have to do is staff the president. You have to prepare the president for his or her engagements on foreign policy and national security. And that could be foreign travel, it could be hosting foreign leaders, it could be foreign leader phone calls, engagements with relevant members on the Hill, representatives and senators. And then the second thing you have to do is you have to run a process which I believe should deliver multiple options to the president, multiple options for policies and decisions to advance and protect our vital interests. The third thing that you do is you communicate. You communicate the president's policies and decisions to relevant audiences. That can be the American people. That could be members of Congress. It could be the departments and agencies themselves. It could be international counterparts. And I don't think there's anything partisan about that. You're stating policy of the administration. And then the fourth key task is to maintain unity of effort with like-minded countries, and to foster and maintain a good relationship with your counterparts. Those are mostly national security advisors. So oftentimes it's other government officials, sometimes heads of state, especially if you have pre-existing relationships with some of them, and can get things done with a phone call or a quick video conference. And then finally, you lead an organization. You provide what we call in the military purpose, motivation, and direction, right, to National Security Council staff. And hopefully you create an environment in which people want to come to work and they know they're making a difference, and they're bound together by common purpose and mutual trust and respect for one another. And so I think to fulfill any of those duties and responsibilities, I don't think it matters whether you're in uniform or not. If you happen to be a serving military officer who's called to take on that job. And it's a great job, by the way. I think it's the best job in Washington.
Great. Sam Byers, go ahead.
Good afternoon, General. For everyone, I'm Sam. I'm a master's student at King's College London at the moment. My question is, both from your experience as a career Army officer, but also from your experience across, kind of seeing across the breadth of the national security architecture. My question is, how do you see the different services relating to each other as we kind of move into an era of great power competition? Where do you see the relative balance of importance shifting as we move from, as we were talking earlier, a kind of land-bound conflict like Afghanistan to more of a great power focus in, say, the Indo-Pacific? What do you think about like the Secretary of Defense's announcement the other week of pushing for a 500-ship Navy? Do you think that's feasible, and so on?
Well, Sam, I think what's more important than ever is that we have the full range of joint capabilities and the ability to operate not only in the domains of land, sea, air, aerospace, cyberspace, but that we can operate across them and project power across multiple domains. And this is what this new concept, a concept that I started working on years ago of multi-domain operations is based on. I think that we have to be pretty careful about resurrecting the flawed assumptions of the late 90s associated with the revolution in military affairs. And this belief in particular that our technological advantages would allow us to operate mainly in the fluid media of the maritime and aerospace domains and cyberspace, and then avoid any kind of conflict on land. This is the whole, bombs without boots approach to warfare. And I think one of the lessons we should have learned the hard way, not only in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but in Libya, for example, is that if you don't do anything to shape, the political outcome, that you're likely to get an undesirable result in that conflict. And so I think it's important for us to recognize the need for all forces. And I'm an Army person, but I think in particular we undervalue land forces because we convince ourselves that, hey, really, really, the next war will be fundamentally different from all those that have gone before it. And as my friend Conrad Crane says, hey, we've never been able to never do it again, right? And so we have to prepare for future conflict with a range of capabilities, because as Con Crane also says, there are really only two fundamental ways to fight: asymmetrically and stupidly, right? And what you see is our potential adversaries trying to match some of our capabilities one-to-one, but really what they're trying to do is take apart what they see as our differential advantages. And they're doing that with some old technologies that have been revised and some new disruptive technologies. These are counter space capabilities. There are electronic warfare capabilities, new versions of electronic warfare. It's long-range missile capabilities and hypersonics. It's tiered and layered air defense, and it's a range of unmanned systems, undersea and unmanned aerial systems as well. These are just some of the emerging capabilities that Russia and China, for example, are trying to combine. I think it's useful to take a look at the invasion of Ukraine as an example, in which Russia used combinations of conventional and unconventional forces to accomplish its objectives below the threshold of what might elicit a concerted military response against it. And then once there are consolidated gains with tiered and layered air defense, for example, that has allowed them to establish air supremacy over Ukraine from the ground. I mean, they don't even have one F-35. And so what you see now is Russia establishing these bubbles, these exclusionary bubbles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and the Crimea to Syria and now over to Libya. And so what they're trying to do is complicate our efforts to have freedom of movement and action with our joint force. And China is doing much the same thing across the Indo-Pacific region. So to defeat that, you need a range of capabilities. And in particular, you have to project power outward from land. I think it's useful from a historical perspective to look at the Japanese centripetal offensive of 1941 and to see how the Japanese military used land to project power outward into the maritime and air domains. And if you were to take that centripetal offensive, which they hoped would convince the U.S. to just, to not respond to Pearl Harbor because we wouldn't have the will to penetrate that inner island chain and threaten Japan. If you just turn that inward toward China, it poses China with a pretty considerable dilemma, right? So I think it'd be a mistake to undervalue any of the services. And really our competitive advantage is to use our armed forces like you would use in the children's game of rock, paper, scissors, right? You have to use all of your armed forces at your joint force in close combination to gain advantages that have to do with surprise, speed of action. All of that is still immensely important. I do believe we're making some really fundamentally wrong assumptions about future war, especially that AI will shift war fundamentally from the realm of uncertainty to the realm of certainty. I believe that future war will be more uncertain because of the enemy's ability to disrupt our communications, our precision navigation and timing, for example, access to space assets, but also because a lot of the information in the databases that we apply artificial intelligence technologies to will be bad, wrong, contradictory, and so I think we have to be careful about not putting all of our eggs in one basket and replicating the flaws of the so-called revolution in military affairs.
Look, I want to make sure that we get you, General McMaster, to your next engagement, and make sure we kind of end on time.
Yeah, so I went on a long time. That's something I've been thinking about for years, and I wasn't expecting that question. So I appreciate it, Sam.
I just wanted to kind of end on one kind of final question for you, which is frankly actually the battleground that AHS plays on, which is the battleground at home, which is how Americans should view their role in the world. We see deep divisions on the left about what that should be, and increasing divisions on the right, and some things that have gone even full circle, right? You see someone like libertarian and conservative Charles Koch and Koch Foundation support a lot of what might traditionally be more progressive foreign policy things in a lot of different ways. You wrote a big article this summer in Foreign Affairs called The Retrenchment Syndrome. And so I'm wondering what you might say to a lot of students out there, young alumni out there, about how should we be thinking about the American role in the world, and what do you think the terms of the debate should be at home about what that is?
Right. Well, I fundamentally believe, Gabe, that America is a force for good in the world. I believe that is a demonstrable fact. I think that in our universities, based on the composition of some of our departments in the humanities, many of which are influenced, I think, in a dominant way by the new left interpretation of history, that many of our young people are subjected not only in higher education, but in secondary school, because it's bled down into the curriculum there, into what I would call a curriculum of self-loathing. And to put it oversimplify it, it is really the interpretation of history that, at a very high level of generality, really it argues that all the ills of the world prior to 1945 were due to colonialism, and all the ills of the world, after 1945 were due to capitalist imperialism. And so, because we define ourselves as the problem, we then assume that our disengagement from challenges overseas would be an unmitigated good. If you think about it, it's a profoundly arrogant interpretation, because it doesn't recognize the role that rivals, adversaries, enemies have. It doesn't recognize their authorship over the future. And it is foundational to this phenomenon of strategic narcissism. And I believe this kind of thinking about America's role in the world has infected both political parties in a way that is very difficult to distinguish between left and right forms of a neo-isolationist sentiment. I think the best way to counter this is through just education, through understanding more fully the historical record. I mean, the only worse thing than ignorance of history is the abuse of history. and the best way to protect against that is to read more of it, think more about it, and I think to reinvigorate the curriculum in diplomatic and military history as well across our institutions.
Well, look, thank you for your time with us today. Thank you for your service to the country. Good luck with the book sales. I know in this era, hopefully it's going to strain your voice, but hopefully save your wrist, and you're doing fewer signatures than you would be normally. So,
well, just for everybody, it's a real page turner, isn't it, Gabe?
I read it in one sitting, to be perfectly honest with everybody. I actually read it entirely in one sitting. So I'll ship it to you, and you can sign it for me and ship it back. So hopefully we'll be able to do this again soon. Good luck with the tour, and hopefully more people hear your approach to this, and obviously buy the book. So thank you, everybody.
What a privilege to be with you, Gabe. Thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who's tuned in today. And hey, thanks especially for the great work that the society does. I mean, I'm really proud to participate in any events with you and the great team you've assembled. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye, everybody.